So what I'm going to ask everybody to do, since we are many here, and it could go on for quite a while, is just to ask each one in turn what their strongest memory of Eric is, or what the most significant thing he gave them that contributed to their work and life generally. So I imagine a number of you have got quite a lot of notes, but if you could just single, the one thing necessary, I'd be very happy. Mike, start with you. Would you do that?
Well, I suppose the most vital memory is of an extraordinary generosity of the man in terms of opening an entire world for me. I mean, I didn't go to King's straight from school. I did rather deplorably in a school that was closed down for endemic violence and academic failure within 2 years of my departure. So I went there as a rather odd human being, and this sense of an entire world, or rather worlds, that were opened up regardless of disciplinary boundary or historical containment, and that movement onto the level of friendship as well. He was, I think as Clive wrote in his obituary, an absolute expert entertainer. Where to start with the work is very, very difficult. Clive, you did ask for just one thing, so I suppose if that is the one thing, that I will hand the mic on. But we will no doubt come to other areas.
I think I wanted to say two things about Eric. One was that I found his example as a professor at King's College who also wrote poetry, who could write a monograph on boroughs, but also a staple chapbook on open field poetry. Immensely helpful, and I think it's in many ways enabled me to do what I've done. That is, I've held on to the idea that creativity and academic work are not mutually exclusive, and that it is possible to be part of a poetry community and help foster it. I mean, Eric was very impressive, and that was very important to me. I think his other legacy is as a poet, and I don't think I can summarize that quite so quickly, but just I would want to say that I think that he, how can I put it, he showed his contemporaries that the British condition in all its nostalgic imperialist corruption could be the subject of poetry, and that this could include alternative histories, knowledges and landscapes of great interest and even beauty. And I think that he pointed the way for many other subsequent poets to explore ways to rethink the legacy of Ezra Pound and European poetry in a particularly British context. I'll stop there, but I'd quite like to say a bit more if I can later.
I was going to have two memories. One was, first of all, from Eric as a teacher when I was an undergraduate. And this is picking up your point about his generosity, where he organised, or he responded to a request for revision seminars and gave these wonderful revision seminars to a group of us, including things like discussing Donne and Middleton in terms of dealing with an overload of information. And memories then of Eric's teaching to do with the energy, the kind of information, the kind of knowledges that he was putting out there, very different from the idea of what are the aims and objectives of this course and how you're going to deliver them. It's a totally different conception of what education means. The other thing very critical was just his organisation of so many conferences, events, the kind of things he was doing at the American Institute. And I'm reminded of one thing that he did do, which was organise events when poets died. He would organise an evening where he would play his recordings of their work. I remember the one for Joel Oppenheimer, where he got so carried away by playing these tapes, he said, "We must all do this again another time."
I just add my own little bit. I met Eric in '61. Didn't go near him. I thought he was too terrifying. And then when I was what I did remember from my undergraduate days was the extraordinary lectures he gave on Shelley and Keats. And I've got the notes from those days. And I remember him going through the Ode to the Nightingale with extraordinary, almost forensic precision. And also very much bringing, which people didn't do in those days so much, very much bringing the politics into something like Shelley's Mask of Anarchy. When I decided to do my MPhil, as it was in those days, with him. He invited me, of course, round to his house in his flat, his downstairs flat, which many of you have seen, in Church Street. And the first thing he said to me, he gave me, very English in a way, he gave me cake and tea, a fruit cake and tea, and he said, "Why do you want to do this?" he said. "The pay's no damn good," he said, being an academic, "and nobody in Britain gives a damn." And then he said, "All right then, if you must." It sort of went on from there. And one last thought with Eric is this phrase, which many of you will have already heard, was, "There's nothing so exciting as something you don't know." And that is so opposite the spirit of academia, where you set limits and investigate that and master the field. And that phrase has remained with me all my life. It was two notions, the gifting hand and the interest in curiosity about something you don't know.
Yeah, it was 1968. I was a very young and naive 18-year-old up at King's. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I found that the English department at King's was heavily skewed towards Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, philology, all that stuff, which, to my horror, I realized is not what I really wanted to do. I signed up for the two optional courses in American literature and modern literature. Modern literature, to my dismay, I found, according to King's English department at the time, ended in 1950, which was the year of my birth. So it sort of reinforced the impression that what I was going to study had nothing to do with my life. Anyway, the first lecture in the modern history syllabus came round, and I was milling around with the other students, and the first I knew of Eric was a great booming guffaw as he entered the room, and I thought, what on earth is that? And it was Eric. He gave a storming lecture in which he made assertions such as the linear novel is finished. And afterwards, I was a very nervous as well as inexperienced young man, and I plucked up the courage to put up my hand and asked him what he meant by that. And he was very kind in his explanation, but what he meant was exactly what he said. The linear novel was finished. And so I got this immense feeling of excitement, as well as being a little bit intimidated by the certainty on the one hand that he evinced, but also, as Clive said, the notion that it was important to go into the unknown and find something new, and that has stayed with me.
As Valerie said in her introduction, Eric could be autocratic, cantankerous, endlessly awkward, but I value his immense generosity in sharing knowledge and encouraging curiosity, as Ken has just remarked. I used to go around to his house fairly frequently to read books that I didn't have, and he kindly offered to lay before me. He would just put them on the table, and I would spend an afternoon reading while he was working, I think, upstairs. Yes, I mean, he was, as I've said, he was an awkward character. I mean, I remember in the 1990s, I'm somewhat ashamed to say I used the word Brit. And, you know, it probably elicited a guffaw, but you could see, you know, he was stunned that I should use such a term. But yes, what stays with me is the encouragement he gave to research a subject, to research an area, and to dig as deep as you could go, and also to be firm about one's sources, but to approach them in an open way. both thematically, of course, and linguistically. There was an element of self-subversion in his work. I take that phrase from the blurb that Alan Fisher did for Legal Poems. And if I could take that somewhere else, I think it's a retention of personal experience while subjecting it to continual inquiry. His experience of the sea, his experience of authority as a teacher. But I'll leave you with a challenge to anybody who has the time to do the research. I assume the answer would be in the archive. Why did he suppress the section about the Ford Halewood strike in interrogation rooms, which I remember hearing when he read it and seemed one of the strongest sections?
Thanks. I was one of Eric's students as a postgrad and before that as an undergrad. And but actually, on both sides, relations were rather cautious, I suppose the word would be. I mean, my sense was that he had a sense of respecting privacy or something like that. But I remember an occasion when several of us had done a reading. It might have been one of those events at Lower Green Farm, and everything was recorded. But for some reason, when I read, the tape recorder had stopped, the cassette recorder thing had stopped. So Eric sent me a note and asked me, would I go round to the flat and just read the poems onto the tape and say anything I'd said on the previous occasion, which seemed rather difficult. But I thought, oh, well, it'll be an opportunity to get to know Eric a bit more, maybe. But actually, you know, when I rang, he just showed me into the room, and the cassette was ready, and I just sat there, turned it on, and read the poems, and that was it, really. I mean, I suppose in a way, I was kind of grateful. I mean, like the difficulty with being his student is that I couldn't understand, I couldn't decipher his writing. So everything was feeling in the dark, really. But I found actually what I remembered is this kind of incredible compacted lyricism in the poetry. Like a whole poem would, you'd be trying to decipher it, and then suddenly a phrase would be like a flash of light, and you could never forget it. And I just found that a marvellous quality. It makes me read on. One of the things I was reading before today was the sequence called A Faithful Private, 1976. And there's a moment in that where he says, the line is about gazing at clear water, not to think of yourself unnecessarily. It's that, and that sort of encapsulated advice. When I think about it, it was probably advice in the Navy for combatants. Just try not to think of yourself unnecessarily, which I think is brilliant advice. But in other ways, it's not too bad a piece of advice for a poet as well, I felt. I mean, but they're tiny fragments of moments or sayings and things like that, actually. I mean, I would copiously write down the lectures. I seem to be able to kind of use a sort of shorthand, put almost everything on the page, and then I could mentally replay the lecture in my head. I can't do that now, of course. But that sort of kind of glimmer phrase or mosaic phrase or tessa, whatever you call it, it's the powerful thing to me about the poetry.
Well, I guess everybody's statement could be elaborated in detail and in many different ways. So I wonder first of all whether that anybody wants to pick up on what anybody said in the panel at all, and then maybe we could throw it out to questions from the audience, because a number of people as I look around have been Eric's students, and he likes to share specific moments and generalizations. I'm just thinking when Peter was talking about lines that suddenly jump up at you, and I just suddenly into my mind came, being a man or woman is hell. We have other means of production. And I was thinking of something that Alan said this morning about Foucault and Marcuse, and this kind of, discussions about Eric's, personal life are endless, and I'm not really interested in them. But a line like that stands out as something, what it reminds me of actually is Simone de Beauvoir, who said a woman's nature is yet to be found out, which I've always absolutely loved. And as far as I'm concerned, that goes for a man's too. And I talked to my wonderful Toronto young nieces, both of whom are fierce feminists, and they say we want liberation for all genders, and that's whatever, from trans to heterosexual. And that phrase of Eric recurs to me again and again when I think about that. There's always something there that would leap out, and can't be ideologically, assigned.
Yes.
Yeah. So I like. Any other? Yes.
Yes, I'd like to say something about lines from Eric's work, but in a slightly different way. I first met Eric when I moved from Swansea to London in 1979, and we met in a pub and had a conversation, and it was a very generous thing, I think, of Eric to meet somebody he didn't know, a young person of unknown potential, when he was a busy academic, a poet, and busy with all these projects we've been hearing about it. And I actually found the conversation a little difficult, and I'll tell you why. He asked me, what poets do you like? And it's one of those questions that makes me freeze. Do I know any poets? I can't remember any names. George Oppen, I say. I've been reading a lot of George Oppen. And then he proceeded to say, he said, my feeling about Oppen is that the stanzas, the writing is always a bit cramped. And I was really thrown by this. I felt that he was sort of saying, well, I don't want to talk to you about poetry. But of course, now when I read him, for example, in Interrogation Rooms in number 29, I see that Eric actually quotes Oppen. He quotes of being numerous, a ferocious mumbling in public, one of the great lines of being numerous. But Eric cleverly, of course, alludes to a lot more in that poem, because what Oppen is saying is it's not easy to speak, a ferocious mumbling in public of rootless speech, of rootless speech. And in fact, this poem of Oppen's is all about the feeling of being cramped. It's about the near obliteration of meaningful language in the subways, the madness of crowds and so on. It really speaks to the concerns that Eric had. And if you look at what Eric also says in that poem, he says it's the least, right with at least a little in Oppen's clarity to poverty. This is the pay window. All governments have burned out. And when I look back, in other words, I think that Eric was opening up a lot of possibilities in that conversation, which I, as this rather young and uncertain newcomer to London and the poetry scene, rather missed. But I think for me that's become a way of thinking about his poetry generally, that there's a richness that Juho also brought out. That the illusions are not just didactic, although they are that too, but they also open all sorts of windows into the future.
Yes, it took me some time to actually start to appreciate Eric's work, and it wasn't until I heard him read that it started to make sense, and we heard there in Merrin's beautiful sequence that there is a lovely breathing quality within the lines, and an extraordinary transaction between the visual and the oral cultures of the text that I think that are performed so beautifully. And interesting to hear you talk about that lyric density. It seems to use the detritus of the lyric apparatus without ever fulfilling it, without ever bringing it to those kinds of fruition of certainty that the lyric affords. I also wanted to pick up on something about his teaching. I think what made him stand out from the other teachers at King's, and there were many really very fine teachers there, was this absolute unshakable and fierce commitment to the social necessity of the arts, and that as students we were doing serious cultural work, and this was not to be taken lightly, and this in no way had an instrumentalist application, which of course in the 2 decades since his death we've seen accelerate with an ever greater intensity. But that idea here of a training of the intellect, that there is an existential responsibility as well as a freedom in the work that he was propagating, and that has certainly never left me.
That sort of links up what Alan was saying this morning about the aesthetic and the ethics. It seems to me very, very, very strongly. I remember starting my MPhil knowing nobody or anybody in London, and I'd be in the British Library, the old British Library, working my way through something by obscure by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then I'd go and have my session with Eric at his house, of course. And, you know, he made me think I was doing the most important thing that anybody in the world could be doing at that moment. I mean, it was that kind of injection of confidence, which I think was absolutely wonderful. Any other? Yes, Gavin.
Yeah, I think one thing that hasn't been aired enough today is the extraordinary fusion of or juxtaposition of popular culture and high art in Eric's work. Obviously this goes back to modernism, but Eric, two examples, the way he uses the deer hunter and the wicker man in A Book of Herne, and his use of Jim Morrison in elegies. He kept his ear to the ground, and he was continually alert to what was going on around him, and would pick up things very quickly from conversation and reading. And I dare say the section of interrogation rooms which I mentioned, which didn't go into the book, was based on a series of articles, perhaps from a socialist worker. And if I could answer my own question with regard to that, possibly he felt that it seemed to have too palpable a design. But I feel that, that political section. But I think it could have been reworked in some more questioning mode.
All I wanted to say was just that it reminds me of, I was going to use this quotation from Charles Bernstein on the back of the North and South selected poets, where he says that Mottram demonstrates how poetry can be political without sacrificing formal investigation, which I just thought it's impossible for me to improve on that formulation, because I think that says so much about why it remains readable. I mean, in the material I was looking at during the week, he's writing about those strikes that took place in California in the 1970s, the United Fruit Workers with Chavez and Dolores Huerta. She's the one who invented the slogan that Barack Obama used, yes, we can. So there's a lot of sort of just mention in this. It's not called an elegy because she wasn't dead, but it's in a similar format. But he expresses this conviction that when they're working on the picket lines and so on, the men and women are completely equal, and no one's asking who's looking after the children or anything like that. But then Eric suddenly says very confidently, of course, at home, the machismo was exactly as it was before. I mean, it's a very dated comment, and it seems impossible that could have been true, actually. But still, the poem as a whole and the sequence as a whole works. And sometimes I think, well, he's talking about the Anthropocene about 40 years before the term developed its current usage. I mean, those anticipations seem to me astonishing. I can remember when he said that people living close to electricity pylons develop different forms of cancer susceptibility. I mean, that didn't become an established fact for 30 years or more. So it's that strange, as you say, he's sort of tuned in to so many different levels of culture. And that's the most impressive, one of the most impressive things, I think.
Can I just add to that very briefly? Picking up from both these contributions, his use of popular culture, his knowledge of popular culture, and his prescience in terms of what they mean, was brought home to me very forcefully this morning, because I spent the entire train journey from the south coast this morning reading the opening essay in the collection Blood on the National Ambassador, which is called The Persuasive Lips, Men and Guns in America. The first half of which is as agonizingly relevant when it was written as it is today, if not more so. The second half is a distillation, a discussion of the Billy the Kid myth in all its facets. And he doesn't give you an overarching narrative. He presents the information, which is meticulously researched, gun manufacturer, gun design, all that sort of thing, which most academics would not go into. And he lays out the information and the connections, and he invites you to draw your own conclusions, and that's what's really quite radical about him, I think.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up in a way those 2 points. That I think that it is striking the way Bernstein picks up on the notion of formal investigation, poetry at its most relevant and uncompromising. And then, as you say, Ken, he leaves it to you to draw your own conclusions. And my strongest defense of his poetry would be that it's open to the future. That it as a poetry, it's quite generous in showing you where you might do things differently, where some things work and some things don't. That I think you can see a whole range of later UK poetries emerging partly out of thinking through what Eric was doing. And it's because of the things you're saying. It's about that sort of that openness, that sense of laying out lots of connections, and often leaving you with a sense that there might be other ways to make the connections, other formal solutions.
But it also goes back to the quotation Peter gave, because one of the other things that Eric used to talk about was not exhausting the reader, with limiting the reader to your limits, of trying to allow the reader to go beyond your own limitations.
Well, we've just about finished our time here. Gavin, your question about why did you leave the strikeout occurred to me when I was going through William Carlos Williams' Patterson. They have half the drafts there and the other half at Buffalo. And there were a whole series of sections on strikes. And Williams left them out of the final version. That could have been McCarthyism. But it might have been the same reason for Eric, that you don't have to make the obvious point.